and I'm like, editing me.
You did well. We had to read it, and we had to watch it. I said you did well.
So many of you know Lauren, she's going to be speaking today on issues presenting LGBTQ asylum seekers and their personal experience, and it is also to Q&A. So at the end.
Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Lauren DesRosiers. I'm the Immigration Law Clinic staff attorney over in the Justice Center. I also am an adjunct professor here teaching client counseling. I'm taking my mask off as long as you stay far away because this is a big room. I'm still getting used to people not masking and seeing folks' faces because, as I was explaining when I used to work with a lot of people who are living with HIV, and I still have a lot of those precautions kind of ingrained in me. So Lauren DesRosiers, I use she, they pronouns. I've been an attorney for a while. I started in big law as a commercial litigator, and it was awful, and I hated it, and I had to find a way out. And I found a way out by getting a fellowship and starting to do a lot of LGBTQ asylum work. I'm running a very informal. So I started doing a lot of LGBTQ asylum work. I had tons of asylum clients. I also did T visas, so for people who were trafficked. B visas for people who had been the victims of a particularly serious crime. Some VAWA cases for people who had been in family relationships where there was violence, all within the LGBT community. I was working at the New York State Violence Project, which is the oldest organization that serves LGBTQ survivors of violence. I started there in 2014 as an intern, so that was my first kind of internship. And my first case was an asylum case for a gay man, and that was the first immigration case I ever watched. And it was really difficult. Talking with him about some of the torture that he'd been subject to, talking to him about the discrimination that he faced was really difficult. And I came away from that summer and I wasn't really sure if I had it in me to do that work full time. Turns out I did. So when I was kind of looking to figure out a way out of big law and find something that was more meaningful, I realized that I really did want to do that work. And so I spent several years going back to those LGBTQ asylum cases. And that first case, the gay man from Lebanon, that was kind of the most straightforward one. Asylum cases take a really long time to adjudicate. So that first case that I ever worked on, he was granted finally asylum last year. And my boss was the one who had to litigate it in front of the court because I'd actually already moved on to this job by that time. But that demonstrates like 2014 to 2021, like 7 years in limbo, not knowing if you're going to actually win your case or not. So a lot of the people who are applying for asylum, who are queer or trans, are already in the US, at least the ones that I was working with. I think a lot of you are taking immigration law or refugee and asylum law and have a sense of the two types of asylum claims, so you can either file affirmatively or file defense or in removal proceedings. You can apply defensively in front of an immigration judge. I I did both in my practice. For the affirmative cases, those are in front of an asylum officer who has special training in adjudicating asylum claims. Those are supposed to be non-confrontational, but while I was working there, it was during the Trump administration, and the humanitarian perspective that is supposed to influence the asylum adjudication was really being attacked. So asylum officers were put in positions where they were being trained on interrogation techniques, being told that they had to do things that were not in line with kind of the traditionally humanitarian aspects of us. And for my clients, who were mostly transgender women from Central and South America and Mexico, they were subjected to a lot of suspicion on the basis of their identity. So in LGBTQ asylum cases, one of the elements that you have to prove, one of the elements of an asylum claim. Yeah, like.
It's qualified as a refugee.
Okay, what's the definition of a refugee?
So I get the loophole answer.
Good one, right? What's a refugee?
All right, so we just went over it yesterday. So the university is you get to reside outside of your country of home origin, and you must not be able to return because of, or be able to receive help from the country, or that country is unwilling to help you because of a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality.
Social group.
Yeah, social group or political opinion.
Perfect. So you have to have a well-founded fear of persecution, either past persecution or a well-founded fear of future persecution based on because of one of those protected characteristics, right? And so for my clients, I didn't mean to be on the spot. So for my clients, I had to prove that they were a member of a particular social group, and that has its own test. But there's precedent that says that if you're gay or trans, maybe trans, the precedent is real gross, and it is really quite offensive. But it has been read to allow transgender people to qualify as a particular social group, so that you don't have to go through that detailed analysis to prove a particular social group for each case. And that makes it a little bit easier because you can say, as long as this person is a member of that group, you don't have to do the extra work of proving that the particular social group is a valid particular social group. If you're doing something that's a bit more amorphous under a particular social group, it can get harder to prove that up because you have to make additional arguments and show additional expert opinions to show that the group is like socially distinct, and I forget the exact test, but it has to be like socially distinct, and if you have the precedent showing that like a gay person is part of that social group, it makes it a lot easier. When was I going with this? Anyway, so proving that my clients were eligible for asylum, one of the elements I had to prove is that my client is in fact gay or trans or queer or what have you. And so their identity is actually put at issue, so they have to prove up their identity. For people who had lived in the closet, who hadn't been able to fully express who they were in their country of origin, having their identity placed under scrutiny by the US government is, it's really invalidating because they already feel like they're not legitimate in that they're starting to come out, and there are all sorts of other kind of like issues where like their identity and being starts being questioned. And so that it's a very invasive process that can be quite traumatic to go through. The US government also is extremely suspicious of people who are gay or trans. Part of the Real ID Act, 2005 was actually instituted because there was a fear that, I'm going to say some words with quotes, so please don't take them out of context, but terrorists were going to dress up as women and like infiltrate the US. So there's like this underlying like anti-trans suspicion that's kind of baked into some of the aspects of immigration law. And so having clients in the asylum office who's being questioned about aspects of their identity by an official from the US government, it can be pretty traumatic. And the individual asylum officers, while they do have some pretty good training, at one point Immigration Equality, which is near national LGBTQ asylum organization, was actually doing training for the asylum office through the Obama administration. And it doesn't seem like that's been reinstituted. But the asylum officers don't have as much training in the administration. And so they don't have the knowledge to not be offensive. So I would go into asylum interviews and have to repeatedly correct the asylum officer to use my client's pronouns because it would repeatedly misgender her on the very basis for why she was applying for asylum, right? Like a trans woman from Mexico who then goes to prove her case in front of the US government, who then gets misgendered, and which would tell her that, you know, her identity is invalid. And so that was always really difficult. For many of my clients, I'm back up. So when you're applying for asylum, like how long before you
it's a year, but there's like a caveat to it, but I can't.
There's exceptions. So one of the exceptions is a changed circumstance, either a changed circumstances in the country of origin. So, for instance, if you were in the US and you were fine with the government in Afghanistan, but then there was a regime change and the Taliban took over, that would be a changed circumstance in the country of origin, such that you could kind of restart your just general, pretty vague guidance that is the best response to the principle of time from change circumstance to file an asylum. There's also like other statutory exceptions if you want to focus on those. Change circumstances. Other change circumstances like being an individual, so if somebody came out or started a gender transition, that would count as a change circumstance such to overcome the many of my clients are trans women who had recently started to transition. And it gets pretty icky because that's a legal term of art. Because in the kind of trans community, like transition isn't always basic, right? And somebody might start to transition and then detransition for a variety of reasons and then restart. And it's not a linear process. Same with if you're gay or bi or queer or pan. It's a spectrum and it's complicated and it's big. The US government does not like big and they don't like state, right? So with many of my clients who are trans who are starting a medical or legal transition, I have to have like really clear arguments that were really invasive into my clients' personal lives about like what medications they were taking and how that was changing their body and all of these things that in like any other context would be extraordinarily inappropriate to put in front of a judge or a US official, right? And just like in common, talking to anybody, even talking to a client, it's like and so in order to prove that change circumstance, I'd have to get really close to my clients such that they were comfortable telling me really, really personal details about their lives and what they were going through in their bodies and their emotions. And that was really hard because then I'd have to go present that in front of an immigration judge or in front of immigration asylum. Some of the asylum officers is really wonderful. My last asylum interview before I took this job was I stayed a week longer to make sure that I would do the asylum interview. It was a transgender woman from Russia. And the asylum officer told me that I wasn't allowed to tell anybody this. I'm going to tell you. And my client made the asylum officer cry during the asylum interview because she was talking about her transition and how in the US she was finally able to be the person that she had always been, but hadn't been able to be in Russia. And so it was just like so touching and moving. And the asylum officer was so wonderful that she was just like so moved by my client. And I think that there's a lot of potential for the process to be revamped in a way that it can be a moving and acknowledging and validating experience. It's just pretty rare. I'm just gonna keep going because then if they have any questions, I'm really just like, yeah.
I have a couple. So as far as, because some trans people, of course, don't feel the need to transition, like they just, identify as trans, and then I would think that would make it a harder case because you're not giving the court something identifiable to say, like, well, they do identify as and they feel this way, but they don't feel comfortable changing their body. So I guess, imagine you've seen that as an issue and how often do you see that come up? And I guess my second concern would be PSG isn't really a strong, point to make in the first place. It doesn't, do you ever try to use something else to prove your asylum case?
Great questions. Yes. And so for your first question, yes. And that's why I can be really problematic. I think you have to learn around that, right? There are ways that you can work with the client to establish a change circumstance despite the US government's dislike and asylum laws dislike that's for emergency. And complexity, right? Because like gender identity and sexual orientation and the lives that people lead are like complex, and we know that they're not cut and dry. society thinks they are, and then the law kind of makes it so. So things like medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, it's hyper-medicalized and pathologized in a way that's the DSM, which is the psychology like handbook for psychologists to diagnoses, had diagnosis for like if you were gay, that was like a pathology until the 1970s, I think. And being gay was actually something that I think it made you inadmissible to class until the beginning. If you were gay, you not be missed until like 30 years ago. That seems big. Creating that evidence, but finding ways to interpret your client's lived reality in a way that is understandable to the U.S. government is a creative challenge for lawyer. Yes, so there are some areas of the law where you want to like be careful about what you argue, and you definitely want to be careful about what you argue in immigration law. I don't mean to give an impression, but I throw everything that I could because you never know what's going to stick, and the burden is always on the applicant or the respondent in immigration court to have the burden of proof to prove their claim, right? And so I would often argue multiple PSGs, and then if there was any way that I could get a political case as well, I would make that. If there was potential for religious thing, I would make that. So I would often try to make like 4 or 5 claims. For instance, I had one client who was from Iran. She was lesbian from Iran. She was made like PSG arguments. I made a religion argument based on her atheist religious practice. Made a political argument based on her beliefs or women's rights, like everything that you can, be as creative as you can, and think about different ways that you can kind of expand the definitions of some of this. Like what does a political claim look like? Is that working for gay rights? Is that organizing for HIV activists? So I won a thing for a man living with HIV/AIDS who was from Central America because he, I argued the PSG claim as a man living with HIV, imputed gay. He was a straight man, but because HIV is seen as a gay disease, like it's an imputed gay. PSG political because of the so as many as you can kind of like put together. I think it's good practice in itself.
I wonder if Sachs is proof that you can file a claim under, because I know that PSG is obviously very ambiguous or very difficult to file a claim for that. I wonder if you can file claims for people as maybe incorrectly under sex, because I know that the Supreme Court recently they had ruled that gay and LGBTQ people shouldn't be discriminated in employment because of the Civil Rights Act, and they reasoned that discrimination based on sexual orientation is pretty much equivalent to discrimination based on sex. So I was wondering if maybe those Supreme Court decisions made it easier on the asylum front
That's interesting. I think it's the opposite. So there's precedent on the Ninth Circuit and several other circuits as well over the past 20 years or so that being LGBTQ in various capacities that's a valid PSG. So PSGs can be harder to prove generally. An LGBTQ PSG is actually quite strong because there's precedent. However, sex or gender in like a gender identity context. So not like trans or cis, but like man, woman, or non-binary or other. There are a lot of cases where women, as women, lose their cases as a PSG, as part of gender PSG or sex PSG, without more. So you would have to say, you would want to argue something a lot more specific. I do always worry about like that, like Bostock or something, like what is going to be the move in a different context. So Bostock was the Title VII case.
Yeah, the civil rights act.
And my first thought was like, what is going to be the case that comes up in the asylum context? So far I don't think it's materialized. But yeah, LGBTQ cases can be strong, depending on the country. One of the things that can always be a challenge is if there's like kind of marginal improvements in a country of origin that cut against persecution. That can be harder to argue that it's unsafe for somebody to return to the country. So like Ecuador is pretty homophobic and there's a lot of violence against LGBTQ people. But the country recently passed gay marriage. And so you have to kind of like get a little bit into the facts on what the actual circumstances are in the country. But yeah, I think that's a good concern. And so much of especially lost like is more such an opinion. It's like I really wait to see what the other shoe when the shoe's gonna drop and where it's gonna drop because you know it's going. There are thoughts on the shoes.
So actually, we kind of talked about this a little bit. Gina said along yesterday is that for PSGs, even after you prove that the person belongs to a PSG, that the other hurdle is proving that they're being persecuted because they're a member of PSG. Is that in practice? Is that or like how difficult is that in practice when you have LGBT clients? Like, how do they come up with evidence of like that's why they're being persecuted?
Yeah, so the nexus element is an important element. And for LGBTQ cases, it's often easier because it can be easier to prove the connection. And one of the ways to do that is to ask your client about not why they think they were persecuted, but like what the persecutor said. So I got really extended my vocabulary in Spanish for the many ways that you can say, I'm going to say a really bad word, so I'm trigger warning. There are lots of different ways to say that, and whenever somebody who's gay or trans is getting persecuted, pretty much inevitably, like their persecutor is going to yell slurs at them. And so that is the way, one of the ways to put that nexus element. And there would often be gender-based slurs or statements as well. So, like the slurs in Spanish, it would be called like mariposa or marica or something like that. Sorry, I'm swearing all over the place. But the gender element would change. So it would be a man calling another person who identified or accepted as a man, feminine term, right? And so that's getting at the gender element of the queerness and gender troubling aspect of the individual's presentation as the reason for the persecution. I got very desensitized to a lot of LGBTQ slurs during my time, just because I was hearing them so I could transfer my plans along. But the nexus element is really can be the trickiest thing to prove for a lot of cases. And getting creative on how you is the great thing about homophobia is like homophobes love to tell you why they're persecuting you, right? So it's I think with LGBTQ cases it's a little bit easier in that aspect. You can admit your setting and
What were the hardest current counter-arguments that you had to overcome?
I didn't really have the thing about a lot of the trial attorneys is that many of them, at least in their really reasonable, not across the board, but a lot of them are pretty reasonable, or they're just not trying that hard in their jobs. Like I had one trial attorney who was literally playing like words with friends on her computer during trial. Oh my goodness. A lot of, if there is a colorable argument about like firm resettlement in another country, or some way to that they can avoid the merits of the claim, that's usually where they'll press. So if somebody already or could have had status in the country, I very rarely had, I don't think I ever had somebody actually try to improve or argue against the merits of the case in like I never had anybody attack the PSG as about the PSG or anything. It was more going after.
So I have a question. So these trial attorneys appeal cases, obviously you're always like arguing against the government. Does the government, do they have to challenge every asylum case, or have you ever had experienced a time where they just conceded that this person had a valid claim?
Yes, the papers too. We put together a strong enough claim, they will just stipulate to asylum that I am not, I think it's still in practice. Let me check this before checking on it. But a couple of years ago, there was a policy or rule that was implemented that wouldn't allow civilians to hold on appeal. So the BIA would be able to reopen fact investigations, regardless of whether a trial attorney stipulated to do anything. So if you had a stipulation and then there was an appeal, and there wasn't anything on the record proving that element, then the BIA could say they didn't put anything forward for this element, or we're gonna like say that they don't meet this element, and you know, don't need the elements of asylum. So I think that's still, that might have been, it might have rescinded that. But that was really difficult because it meant that you had to fully litigate. That was.
Yeah. I guess from a client counseling perspective, what were your, like, I guess, best practices going about discussing like incredibly traumatic and asking questions that would ultimately make people feel invalidated because you had to in order to build your case?
I would put it in the client scale. Like for asylum cases, the client testimony is right. So you have to get a really detailed statement from the client. I'm usually like 30 pages long. For both affirmative and and so once I would get through the raw balance, like, this is a persecution, what was going to go in the affidavit declaration. There would be things that would come up, and then there would be like, okay, well, there's this instance that the client doesn't want to talk about, but they know about, they in the first meeting. And I just like usually let the client decide when they want to talk about it. And if they're avoiding it, you know, have a discussion about like, we have to talk about this thing. We'll only talk about it once. It will take an hour and a half. I have to get every detail because I don't, then the government isn't going to, or it opens it to the government not believing you on this incident. I promise that we will only touch on it once, and then once again, when your statement is read back to you. When do you want to do that? Do you want to do that today? Do you want to do that next week? And like let the client have a little bit of control about when we go into that, because then they can sit around doing that. Therapy. I was very lucky that some of my clients had an in-house clinical social worker that we could send them to after having a traumatic session. So like I could be as careful with them as I could for that hour and a half that I had them, and then we could decompress with a social worker afterwards. That was really helpful in making sure that my clients were cared for professionally. And even if they didn't have an in-house social worker, I tried to get them therapy elsewhere because it's the process of so traumatic, in addition to really traumatic. Dislikes, contentions.
Contentions, clients of color who are LGBTQ, are there any sort of client counseling things that you have to be more careful with?
Can you say that for clients of color?
Yeah, is there anything that in the client counseling kind of realm that you have to be more careful with when you're eliciting information from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a white person, and I'm very conscious that I am privileged in my immigration status and where I am coming from, and that I'm not going to understand the complexities of the multiple identities that my clients have, right? So like they might not even, I might make assumptions about any aspect of their life, but especially like their racial identities. And that holds true for the fact exploration across the board. So thinking of, I had one client who was a man from Honduras, and it was, the persecution that he suffered was unclear how much of it was based on his gay identity and how much was based on his race, because as a Black man, like he experienced a lot of persecution on the basis of his race. I think that as somebody who holds that privilege, it's important to follow the client's lead in being sensitive to what they're saying and receptive to what they're putting forth. And I think acknowledging that power dynamic can be really helpful. Because the client is the expert in their life and story, especially with an asylum case, and being conscious of my privileges and my prejudices and my assumptions is going to not just make it more or less difficult for me to do a competent fact investigation, but is going to be the difference of whether the client trusts me or not. And if the client doesn't trust me as their attorney, then there's not really a point in. And there's that's the key. And so I think asking how they identify and asking sensitively about race, about religion, about politics, and figuring out ways to do that sensitivity while also sometimes pushing your client to talk about things they don't want to do is difficult and also so important. And making putting yourself in a situation where you can't help yourself to ask about certain things. I don't know if that really addressed your question.
Yeah, hard question.
Yeah. And you have to clarify clients and you have to interpret it in a way that the U.S. will understand, and the U.S. immigration system is super racist. So figuring out ways to do that while trying to stay true to your client is can be difficult.
There aren't any more questions. Only 10 minutes left, so we can end early, or unless you have anything else.
I really loved that job. It's really great. I loved my clients. I still talk to my clients. It's a tricky area of law. Working with LGBT immigrants is really rewarding. It's a really good opportunity to think about individuals and honor the individual client. I really loved all of my clients, and it's just a really great experience. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.